Hello, my name is Matt. Welcome to Unbearable 73. In this video, I compare the events of Season 1, Episode 1 of Amazoff's Rings of Prime to the Tolkien Legendarium, pointing out the differences. I have a separate companion video where I review the actual episode on its own merits. When I started this, I figured maybe I'd have a 10-minute video highlighting the worst of the deviancies, and then as I got in, I felt like I was starting to write a term paper. So I'm kind of set on for something in between. In some cases, I'm going to provide specific references and citations and give us a lot of details, and others I'm just going to give you the short and sweet of it. I don't think you and I want to be here for 2 hours, and if this video hits more than 15 minutes, I might break it up into two pieces. My points of interest in this video are centered around 17 points where I captured a referential image. And once more, I dropped the caveat that Amazon has to make chunks of this up because they don't have the rights to large parts of the lore. Now let's begin. Slide 1, where it all began. This first part is going to be the largest information dump, which is still less than a 17-minute expositional dump that Galadriel dropped at the opening of this. The show opens with Galadriel describing growing up in the Undying Lands under the lights of the two trees of Valinor, Telperion and Laurelin. She then says that Morgoth destroyed the two trees, burning them according to the visual which had led to the elves leaving the Undying Lands to wage war on Morgoth. I'll point out here that Finrod, who was the oldest of Finarfin and Eowyn's 4 children, and Galadriel, the youngest, were all born in the years of the two trees in Valinor, as were Celebrimbor and Gil-galad. Elrond and his twin brother Elros were born in Middle-earth after the Noldor had returned. So basically, what happened, and note I'm grossly oversimplifying here, the original light of Arda, which is the Earth, were the two lamps, one at the North Pole and the other at the South Pole. They were Iluin in the north and Ormal in the south during what is referred to as the Spring of Arda. Of course, Morgoth, then still being known by his original name Melkor, destroyed them, leading to destruction that reshaped Arda dramatically. After that, the Valar created the two trees, Telperion and Laurelin. Naturally, Morgoth had to do something about that, so he enlisted the aid of the primordial being, the great spider Ungoliant. Ungoliant shrouded herself and Morgoth in webs of darkness and shadow, and they were able to sneak into Valinor. Morgoth wounded the two trees with his spear, and then Ungoliant consumed the energy, which was the light of the trees, as well as draining wide the wells of Varda, thus making it impossible for them to restore the trees. The only light left from the two trees was that which Fëanor had captured in the Silmarils. Morgoth had also stolen the Silmarils a little after this, as well as all the jewels of the Noldor, killing Fëanor's father, Finwë, who was the king of the Noldor at the time, who had been alone defending them. Depending on the variations on that story, okay? Already somewhat unbalanced due to having his birth mother die as a result of delivering him, and then his mother refusing to reincarnate, whereupon his father was allowed to remarry, which also upset Fëanor, and then Morgoth's manipulations made Fëanor think that the Valar wanted to steal the Silmarils from him. The final straw was his father's death and the death of the Silmarils. To make a long story short, Fëanor and his sons swore an oath, known as the Oath of Fëanor, which basically said they wouldn't rest until the Silmarils had been recovered, and they would slaughter anyone in their way. The bulk of the Noldor elves followed Fëanor's lead. In the published canon, Galadriel followed Fëanor, agreeing with him that Silmarils needed to be recovered and Morgoth dealt with, but since she didn't trust Fëanor to begin with, she did not swear any oaths. Galadriel is one of the most powerful telepaths who is not a Maiar, and she sensed the darkness within Fëanor. In fact, Galadriel and Fëanor are pretty much considered the two most powerful elves. Okay, Fëanor had asked for 3 strands of her hair to put inside the Silmarils, which she refused. Her giving Gimli the 3 locks of her hair was a final rebuke to Fëanor, as she sensed Gimli had true honorable and good intentions. The break between Fëanor's group of Noldor and the smaller group following Galadriel happened when Fëanor and his followers asked the Teleri, who were basically sailing elves, keeping it simple there, to provide ships for the Noldor to travel to Middle-earth. The Teleri refused because the Noldor leaving was against the will of the Valar. This led to an escalating conflict between Noldor and the Teleri at Alqualande. The second host of the Noldor arrived, led by Fingon, and thinking the Teleri had attacked their Noldor kindred, joined the fight. A lot of the Teleri were killed. This became known as the first kinslaying, or the kinslaying at Alqualande. This, as I said, is when Galadriel broke away from Fëanor. She fought to defend her Teleri kin. She was her mother was of the Teleri, her father was of the Noldor. The bulk of the Noldor, led by Fëanor, sailed to Middle-earth. Galadriel and her followers passed over the icy north and traveled via land to get to Middle-earth. Because of the kinslaying at Aquilande, Mandos, the Valar who oversees fate and death, proclaimed the doom of Mandos over all those Noldor who continued in their rebellion after the first kinslaying. This included Galadriel. Basically, because they didn't immediately go back to Valinor and and so forth. Eventually, to make a long story short, the Noldor seem to be gradually losing the war against Morgoth, and then Eärendil the Mariner, a man, not an elf, and therefore forbidden to step foot in Valinor, sailed to Valinor to beg the aid of the Valar in ending the war and dealing with Morgoth because of all the damage he was inflicting. This led to the War of Wrath, which is the first time winged dragons emerged, and you saw a depiction of that in his show. At the end of the War of Wrath, the doom of Mandos was lifted. Most of the Noldor began returning over the next couple hundred to 1,000 years or so. Many of the Sindarin and Nandor elves, who were the elves who never made the original trip to Valinor, like for instance Legolas is a Nandor elf, and Celeborn, Galadriel's husband, is a Sindarin elf. They decided to begin making the trip overseas as well. Galadriel stayed in Middle-earth with the consent of the Valar because she wanted to explore it, gain knowledge, and remain with her husband Celeborn, whom she met in Doriath and was of the Sindarin. Celeborn seems to be noticeably missing in this crap show. So what happened to Sauron at the end of the First Age? Eonwy, the herald of Manwë, told Sauron he was ordered to return to Valinor to face Manwë's judgment. Sauron was in fact briefly repentant, but the combination of his fear of Manwë's judgment and how well Morgoth had sort of indoctrinated him, basically, overwhelmed his desire for repentance or willingness to do it, and so he decided he basically didn't go. Right? And then spent the next went in hiding for several hundred years, rebuilding the power base because he now has to be the Dark Lord, so to speak. On a final note, Galadriel mentions that the elves have no words for death. That's nonsense. Feanor's mother's death was a legendarily infamous incident, and she certainly would have known about that. Two of the elven words for death are from Quenya, the word Nuru, N-U-R-U, and in Sindarin, one you might be more familiar with, G-U-R-T-H, Girth. The name of this word, Girthang, literally means iron of death. I hope my long expositional dump was not as bad as that was in the show. I mean, it was 10 minutes less, so it couldn't have been as bad. Now, let's go to our next slide. Galadriel at Autumno. I don't think they name it in the show, but this Arctic fortress is Morgoth's ancient fortress of Autumno. Galadriel never, ever went to Autumno. In fact, it will be impossible. Autumno was destroyed literally down to its roots by the Valar in a war before she was born. In roughly 1000 of the Year of the Trees, and Galadriel was born in either 1350 Year of the Trees or 50 or 6, a couple hundred years later. Short point. The Valar literally ripped it apart down to its roots, and they dug Morgoth out of it and then chained him up. I don't know why they even bother with Autumno. After the Valar destroyed Autumno, Sauron, being Morgoth's number 2 guy, in Morgoth's secondary fortress of Angband, rebuilt his forces. This is where Xenoladriel should have gone. Right. So let's go to slide number 3. Elves are immune to all but extremes of temperature and environmental conditions. At those extremes, only then do they begin to react how a normal person might. In other words, if it's 20 degrees out, the elf doesn't immediately start freezing. They get cold, as if they begin to feel chilly. It would be reasonable to assume the elf was tired or wounded, but not cold. Putting a cloak on an elf should not have had any effect. Also, in the lore, they wouldn't need torches. Not only do they have Galadriel with them, who has power and can make light and stuff. We see literally make light in Peter Jackson films. But they're elf lords, having seen the light through trees and been to the Undying Lands. They not only have enhanced elven senses, but literally should be able to make them glow with light or make this an act of power. These are all multi-thousand-year-old elf lords, high elves. Scene 4. In this scene, the elf says he had lost feeling in his hand. Galadriel responds that this place is so evil that the torches are not giving off heat. Again, elves are immune to all but the most extreme temperatures. Also, if the torches were not emitting heat, either they would not be lit or they would explode. In other words, there would be no heat being generated because there's therefore no light, or to contain heat, they'll become bombs. Mm-hmm. It's time for the stupid Xenoladriel. Hey, look at me! I put an extra slide in. So we got the Xenoladriel elf warrior princess fight scene. So the only thing that she was missing were mithril chakrams. Literally, the hobbits in that fight with the troll and Moria did better than several thousand-year-old powerful expert elf warriors. Okay, a group of elf warriors who were literally like over 1,000 years old minimum, trained warriors with power, or should have power. They don't show them there. Had more trouble with this troll than any of the hobbits did in their fight in Lord of the Rings. Now, I know some people are going to bring this up. It accounted for in the Silmarillion that Galadriel is an exceptional athlete, capable of competing with the greatest of elven athletes. So, yeah, she can do phenomenal athletic feats. That's a given. Also, she's over 3,000 years old, and as such, she's probably better at fighting with a sword or any other weapon than most living men or elves. But this visual depiction is over the top. PJ ran a fine line with Legolas in his movies, doing some crazy stuff, but he kept it to a minimum. The only really egregious scene to me was the one with Legolas and the Oliphant. This would not be how Galadriel fought, which is not to say that she might not use a sword if needed. Here's a depiction literally from the appendices, which Amazon has, that show how Galadriel would have fought. Okay, or, 3 times Lorien had been assaulted from Dol Guldur, but besides the valor of the elven people of that land, the power that dwelt there was too great for any to overcome, unless Sauron had come there himself. Though grievous harm was done to the fair woods of the borders, their assaults were driven back, and when the shadow passed, Celeborn came forth and led the host of Lorien over the Anduin in many boats. They took Dol Guldur, and Galadriel threw down its walls and laid bare its pits, and the forest was cleansed. Contrast that passage with Galadriel posing anime style for the camera after she finishes with the ice troll. Tolkien would have been rolling over in his grave. I got the impression watching that scene that maybe they thought it was a World of Warcraft fight. Now we get to the beginning of how they actually depict Valinor in Rings of Prime versus the actual Legendarium. In the lore, prior to the War of Wrath, you could literally travel overland to the far north between Valinor and Middle-earth. Of course, the War of Wrath sunk a large part of ancient Europe, so that option went away in the Second Age. Still, for the entirety of the First Age, and most of the Second, until Eru smote Numenor and made the earth curve so that the straight path to Valinor could only be sailed by those allowed to, which basically means the elves and the Maiar, the elves and Maiar could sail back and forth prior to that event. Okay? It was just a long boat trip. Even after Eru changed things, the straight path was still just a boat trip. Now for Xenoladriel, commander of the northern armies, versus Galadriel, the Lady of Eriador, lots of titles. I'm going to belabor it. In the lore, mostly in the parts Amazon does not have access to, Galadriel and Celeborn left Lindon shortly after Gil-galad was crowned the 4th High King of the Elves. Galadriel and Celeborn traveled for a time while gaining a following consisted of Noldor, Sindar, and Nandor elves. They were considered the rulers of the elves of Eriador at one point. Around 500 of the Second Age, Galadriel sensed a great evil beginning to do its work in Middle-earth. This was Sauron, but she didn't know that. In response, Galadriel and Celeborn moved near Khazad-dûm. There they established the region we call the Region. While Celeborn didn't like the dwarves, Galadriel, because of our Noldor heritage, where she had learned from and venerated both Aule and Yavanna, as did the dwarves, she saw the potential of alliance with them, and the Noldor were kind of like the dwarves. Okay? This led to the great elven smiths under the leadership of Celebrimbor to travel to the region and establish the city of Ulster Hill in 750 of the Second Age. Celebrimbor and his smiths established a long-lasting friendship with the dwarves of Moria. The alliance that Galadriel and Celeborn created negated Sauron's manipulations at the time. Sauron realized that Galadriel was the primary elven power in the region and manipulated events to sow discord between Celebrimbor and his smiths against Galadriel and Celeborn. He came in the form of Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, who claimed to be a messenger from Valinor from Aule. As an Anatar had shared his gifts of crafting and lore with Celebrimbor and his smith. Galadriel sensed that he was lying and not a servant of Aule, but she didn't recognize that it was Sauron. Sauron sowed dissension, which led to Celebrimbor and his people seizing power in the region. Galadriel and Celeborn left the area. Galadriel traveled through Moria to Lorinand, but Celeborn wouldn't enter Moria because of his hostility towards the dwarves, so he stayed in the region for a while. So no, Galadriel is not the commander of the northern armies. That is not to say she did not engage in military leadership or strategy, that sort of thing. She was a high-ranking noble, and she was right in with the Noldor command structure when they put it together to go back to chase the Silmarils. Slide number 9. I'm going to keep this one simple. There was no discord between Gil-galad and Galadriel. Aside from knowing each other for 2,000 years, she backed him to become the High King of the Elves at the beginning of the Second Age, and they worked together for the entirety of the Second Age until Gil-galad's death in the War of the Last Alliance. what days of peace? In the actual lore, the elves, dwarves, and men have been fighting on and off against Sauron's forces for hundreds of years before the rings were forged. And they even knew it was Sauron that they were fighting for thousands of years before the events that led to the sinking of Numenor. This was known, okay? No, again, this is the Elven Rapture, basically. No, this event is not unrivaled in Elven lore. In the actual lore, the elves could literally sail back from Numenor, between Valinor and Middle-earth, as I've said before. Honestly, this scene felt like some of the writers had been watching Logan's Run right before they wrote this, and thought it would be cool to borrow some scenes. Okay, this video is getting a little long, so I'm going to make a part 2. So I'm ending part 1 right now. I'm going to start part 2 in a few seconds.